They planned a full-blown 300-person festival on my land without ever asking me. And the thing is, I didn't yell. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't even argue. I just opened a gate and let my cattle do what cattle have always done, and somehow that was enough to shut the whole thing down. Now I wish I could tell you this all happened in a single afternoon, something clean and quick, but truth is, this thing had been building for years, slow like rust, quiet like a fence post leaning just a little more every season until one day it finally gives. I've owned that stretch of land just outside Mill Creek since 2012, 30 acres give or take. Nothing fancy, but it's honest ground, the kind that feeds you if you treat it right. And I've spent more mornings out there than I can count, coffee in one hand, boots still damp with dew, just watching the herd settle into their rhythm like they always do. I run registered Black Angus, about 100 head most seasons, sometimes a few more depending on calves and how the market's looking, and I keep a couple of breeding bulls off to the east side behind a second gate, because if you know anything about bulls, you don't take chances. Everything I do out there runs on a schedule, not because I'm obsessive, but because that's how you keep land healthy. You rotate grazing, let one section rest while the other works, and that rotation has been pinned to the same corkboard in my barn for over a decade. Same dates, same pattern, never really changing because it works. Now on the other side of my west fence, that's where things started getting complicated, because about 2 years after I bought the place, they built a subdivision out there, neat little houses, trimmed lawns, folks moving in from the city looking for quiet country living. And for the most part, I kept to myself, waved if someone waved, fixed my fence when kids leaned on it too hard, nothing dramatic. But then came the homeowners association, and if you've ever dealt with one, you already know where this is going. Their president at the time was a woman named Carol Bennett. Well, that's what we'll call her. And she had that kind of voice that sounded polite until you realized it wasn't really a request, more like a decision she expected you to agree with. First time she came by, it was spring. I remember because the grass had just started coming in thick, and she stood at my gate with a clipboard, smiling like we were already on the same page. She said, "We're planning a neighborhood picnic, something small, just families, kids, maybe 50 people, and your front meadow would be absolutely perfect." I didn't even hesitate. I just shook my head and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that land's part of an active agricultural operation. I'm not set up for public events, and I'm not insured for that kind of use." She blinked a couple times, like maybe she wasn't used to hearing no, but then she smiled again, tighter this time, and said, "Oh, of course, I understand," and she left. Second time was about 6 months later, same gate, different season, same request dressed up a little nicer, and I gave her the same answer, maybe a little firmer, and again she walked away without a scene, and I figured that was the end of it. I really did. What I didn't see coming was that she wasn't asking anymore. She was just figuring out a different way to get what she wanted. It was early April when I first noticed something off. I was walking the fence line like I do every week, checking for breaks, making sure no posts had shifted, and I saw these bright orange survey stakes driven into my soil, right there in the front pasture, clean lines like someone had already mapped out a layout. At first I thought maybe the county had come through for some utility work, but then I reached my gate and saw a printed notice zip-tied to the post, flapping in the wind like it belonged there. I pulled it off, read it once, then again slower, and I remember just standing there, not angry yet, just confused. It said a temporary event permit had been approved for a community festival, food vendors, live music, tents, seating for up to 300 people, scheduled for the second Saturday in June, location listed as my parcel number. No phone call, no knock on the door, not even a courtesy heads up, just a piece of paper telling me what was going to happen on my own land. I went back to the house, sat down at the kitchen table, read that notice 3 more times, and I could feel something shifting in my chest. Not panic, not even anger exactly, just that slow, steady realization that someone had decided my property was theirs to use, and they'd done it through channels I hadn't even known existed. That's when I picked up the phone and called the county permit office, because I figured there had to be some mistake, some mix-up with parcel numbers or zoning maps, something that made sense. The clerk who answered sounded half asleep, like this was just another routine call, and I gave him my parcel ID, asked him to pull the file, and after a few seconds of typing he said, "Yeah, I see it here, approved under the community stakeholder provision." I said, "What does that even mean?" And he explained, real casual, that civic organizations can apply to use adjacent land for temporary events if the landowner qualifies as part of the same municipal district. And apparently, because my taxes run through the same district as that subdivision, I qualified, whether I liked it or not. I leaned back in my chair, stared at the ceiling for a second, and asked him the one question that ended up mattering more than anything else, though I didn't know it yet. I said, "Does that permit mention anything about livestock?" There was a pause, more typing. Then he said, "No, sir. It lists the land as open and undeveloped." And right there, something clicked, quiet but clear, like a latch falling into place. I thanked him, hung up, and just sat there for a minute, listening to the house settle around me, thinking about that corkboard in the barn, about the schedule that had been there for 11 years, about how I hadn't changed a single date on it since the day I wrote it out. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I wasn't about to move my life around for someone else's party either. So I drove back out to the barn that same afternoon, not in a rush, just steady, like I always do when something needs figuring out, and I stood there in front of that corkboard longer than I probably needed to, just looking at those dates like they might have changed on their own. But they hadn't. Of course they hadn't. June 1st was still marked as rotation day, same as every year. Move the full herd to the east pasture. Let the front section rest through summer. Nothing unusual, nothing aggressive, just the system doing what it was designed to do. And I remember thinking, if I change this now, if I move things around because someone else decided to throw a party on my land, then what exactly am I running here? A farm or a suggestion? That thought kind of settled it for me, not in an angry way, more like a line drawn quietly in the dirt. I wasn't going to fight them with noise. I wasn't going to show up at some HOA meeting and argue with a room full of people who'd already decided they were right. I was just going to keep doing what I've always done and let the situation meet reality on its own terms. Now, that doesn't mean I did nothing, because doing nothing and doing things properly are two very different things, and I've been around long enough to know the difference. First thing I did was call the county agricultural office, not the permit side this time, but the folks who actually deal with livestock regulations, and I filed what they call a courtesy notice, standard procedure anytime you're running a large herd near areas where public access might be expected. I listed everything: number of cattle, breed, presence of breeding bulls, fencing layout, water access, all of it, and I made sure every line was filled out clean because paperwork, when it's done right, has a way of speaking for you when you're not in the room. The woman on the other end, her name was Diane. She'd handled my records before, and she paused halfway through and said, "You expecting company out there?" And I just chuckled a little and said, "Something like that?" And she didn't press, just told me everything looked in order and that an inspector might swing by closer to the event date. Standard check, nothing to worry about. That part actually made me feel better, because if this was going to play out, I wanted it documented from every angle. Over the next couple weeks, I started noticing more activity along the fence line. Trucks pulling up on the subdivision side, people walking around with measuring tapes, bright vests, pointing at things like they were already imagining where everything would go. And one morning I saw a couple guys actually come rough my gate, carrying folded tables like it was already theirs. I walked over, kept my voice even, and said, "You boys lost." One of them looked up, kind of surprised, and said, "Oh, we're setting up for the festival." Like that explained everything. I nodded, leaned on the fence post, and said, "You might want to double-check who owns this land before you get too comfortable." They exchanged a look, not rude, just uncertain, and one of them muttered something about having permits, and I just said, "I'm sure you do," and left it at that. Because again, not my job to stop them, not yet. About a week later, Carol showed up again. Same polished smile, same clipboard, but this time there was something different in the way she stood, like she wasn't asking for anything anymore. She was just informing me of what was going to happen. She said, "I wanted to let you know everything's been approved. We'll have vendors arriving the Friday before, and we'll make sure to leave the property just as we found it." I couldn't help but laugh a little at that, not loud, just enough that she noticed, and I said, "Ma'am, you didn't find this property." "I did." Her smile tightened, just like before, but there was a flicker of irritation this time, and she said, "Well, legally speaking, the county has authorized temporary use under the community provision, so there shouldn't be any issues." I nodded slowly, like I was taking that in. Then I said, I've got a question for you. Did that permit mention anything about cattle? She hesitated, just for a second, and that told me everything I needed to know, but she recovered quick and said, the land was categorized as open space. I tilted my head a little and said, that's so. And then I just shrugged, pushed off the fence, and said, well, I guess we'll see how it all fits. She didn't like that answer, I could tell, but she didn't have anything to push back with either. So she turned and walked back to her car, heels clicking against the gravel like she was trying to keep control of something that was already slipping. By the time June rolled around, they were in full preparation mode. Tents stacked near the fence, portable stages laid out in sections, stacks of folding chairs wrapped in plastic. And if you stood there long enough, you could almost picture it the way they did. Music playing, kids running around, food trucks lined up like a postcard version of small-town life. And for a brief moment, I'll admit, I wondered what it would have been like if they'd just asked the right way, maybe worked something out, limited the space, respected the operation. But that moment passed quick, because respect isn't something you assume after the fact. June 1st came in clear and warm, just like it always does, and I started the rotation early that morning, same as every year, opened the gate to the east pasture, and let the herd move at their own pace, slow and steady, hooves pressing into the soil like they were claiming what was already theirs. All 112 head made the shift, cows, calves, the whole line, and I made sure the secondary gate stayed secured where the bulls were separated, because even I'm not reckless enough to mix that into the equation. By midday, the pasture was alive again, cattle spread across the field, grazing, settling, doing exactly what cattle do when they're where they're supposed to be. And here's the part that still makes me shake my head a little. The HOA crew didn't stop. They kept setting up around them. I watched from a distance as they drove stakes into the ground between grazing animals, unfolded tables, while cows wandered past like curious neighbors, even started assembling part of the stage, while a couple steers stood off to the side chewing like they'd paid for front row seats. Nobody seemed to want to be the one to say, hey, maybe this isn't going to work. And I didn't say it either, because by then, it wasn't my lesson to teach, it was theirs to learn. A few days before the event, just like Diane had mentioned, a county inspector showed up, older guy, calm demeanor, the kind who's seen enough to not jump to conclusions. He parked by the gate, walked in without much fuss, clipboard in hand, and started making his way across the pasture. I stayed back at first, just watching, letting him take it in on his own terms, and I could see the moment it hit him. The scale of it, the fact that this wasn't empty land. This was a working herd, moving, breathing, unpredictable in all the ways livestock naturally are. He stopped near the center, looked around at the tents, the stage frame, the cattle weaving through it all, and then he pulled out a code book from his back pocket, flipping through it like he already knew what he was looking for, but wanted to be precise. I walked up then, not in a hurry, just enough to be there if he had questions, and he glanced at me and said, "This your operation?" I nodded and said, "Yes, sir, has been for a while." He looked back out over the field, then down at his book, and said, almost to himself, "Well, that's going to be a problem." He stood there a long second after saying that, just kind of letting the weight of it settle, flipping one more page in that code book like he was giving the situation every possible chance to prove him wrong. But it didn't, because there wasn't anything to prove. It was all right there in front of him, a full herd spread across active pasture, equipment wedged in between animals that had every right to be exactly where they were. He finally looked up at me and said, "You running over 100 head out here?" And I nodded. 112 as of this morning. And he let out a slow breath through his nose, not annoyed, not impressed, just resolved. "County safety regs," he said, tapping the page with his finger, "require a minimum 100-foot buffer between any permitted public gathering and unrestrained livestock, and that's assuming controlled conditions, which this isn't." He turned in a slow circle, scanning the field again, and I could see him doing the math in his head, measuring distances, looking for any slice of land that might still qualify, but there wasn't one, not a single stretch of that pasture left untouched by cattle movement. "There's no compliant space here," he said finally, and this time it wasn't to himself, it was official. Now here's the thing. I didn't smile, I didn't say, "I told you so." I just nodded like we were talking about the weather, because at that point, the situation had moved beyond opinions. He pulled out his phone, stepped off to the side, and made a call, speaking low but clear, referencing the permit number, citing code sections, using that tone people use when they know the decision's already made and they're just putting it into the system. I wandered a few steps away while he did that, checked a fence post, adjusted a latch. Nothing urgent, just giving him space to do his job without feeling like he was being watched. By the time he came back over, he had that look on his face that said the wheels were already turning somewhere else. Paperwork moving, notifications going out. Permits being suspended pending compliance review, he said, and I just tipped my hat a little and said, understood. That was it. No drama, no raised voices, just a quiet end to something that had been pushed too far from the start. What happened next, though? That's where it got almost surreal. By that afternoon, word had started spreading through the vendors, and you could see it ripple outward like a slow wave, one truck pulling out, then another, a couple of guys dismantling part of the stage they'd barely finished putting together, shaking their heads like they'd walked into the wrong job site. The tent company came back the next morning, and I'll never forget the look on one guy's face when he stepped into the pasture and saw 3 cows laying down right up against one of the support poles like it was the most natural thing in the world. He just stopped, hands on his hips, and said, "Well, that's new." And his buddy behind him laughed, not because it was funny exactly, but because sometimes that's all you can do when reality doesn't match the plan. They worked around the herd as best they could, moving slow, giving the animals space, pulling stakes out of the ground one by one, while calves wandered past like curious supervisors. And through all of it, I didn't interfere, didn't direct, didn't correct, because none of it was mine to fix. Carol called that afternoon. First time around, I let it ring. Second time, too. By the third call, I already knew what she was going to say, how the tone would have shifted from confident to urgent, maybe even a little desperate, and I'll be honest. I just didn't feel the need to pick up. Not out of spite, not even out of satisfaction, but because there was nothing left to discuss that hadn't already been decided by the choices she made weeks earlier. I did see her once more, though, from a distance, standing by the edge of the fence, looking out over the pasture like she was trying to understand where exactly things had gone wrong. And I remember thinking, it didn't go wrong. Not really. It just went exactly the way it was always going to when you build something on an assumption instead of a conversation. The herd settled back into its routine within a couple days. Grass got a chance to breathe. The pasture looked like it always does in early summer, alive but calm, like nothing unusual had ever happened there. And that's probably the strangest part of the whole thing. For me, nothing changed. I didn't adjust a single date on that board, didn't move a fence, didn't reroute a path. I just kept running my operation the same way I always have, and the rest of it, well, the rest of it kind of unraveled on its own. Now, I've had people ask me since then if I planned it that way, if I saw the loophole and decided to make a point, and I always tell them the same thing. I didn't plan anything new. I just didn't change what was already in place. There's a difference there, and it matters more than people think. Because if I had moved the herd early, or delayed the rotation, or done anything outside of my normal operation, then maybe there'd be an argument. Maybe it would have turned into a back and forth about intent, but there was none of that. Every step I took was documented, scheduled, consistent with over a decade of records, and when the county looked at it, they weren't seeing a reaction. They were seeing a system that had been there long before the festival was even an idea. I still think about that sometimes, especially when I drive past the subdivision and see people out walking their dogs or kids riding bikes along the sidewalk. And I wonder if they know how close they came to having 300 people gathered right up against a live herd, or if all they remember is that the event got unexpectedly canceled. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe not every story needs to be fully understood by everyone involved. But I'll tell you this much, if she had just knocked on my door one more time, not with a clipboard, not with a plan already decided, but with a real conversation, things might have gone differently. Not guaranteed, but possible. And that's the part that sticks with me more than anything else. Not the cancellation, not the inconvenience, but the fact that somewhere along the line, asking turned into assuming, and assuming is a risky thing when you're dealing with land that doesn't belong to you. So now I'm curious what you think. Was that fair, the way it played out? Should I have stepped in earlier, made it clearer, or even tried to stop it before it got that far? Or is it on them for pushing something through without ever really understanding what they were stepping into? Go ahead and drop your thoughts in the comments. because I've heard both sides of this more times than I can count, and I've got a feeling this is one of those situations where there's no clean answer, just a line, and which side of it you think matters more.